They called her cursed, ugly, damaged, unsellable, but none of them knew what her hands had done. The night her world burned, she didn't run. She ran into the fire to save her little brother. She carried him through smoke and flame, his skin blistered, her own face seared. The scar they mocked, it wasn't shame, it was sacrifice. And now, years later, in a desert no one remembers, a blind cowboy kneels before that scar and whispers, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." This isn't just a tale of love. It's about what we survive, what we carry, and the rare souls who finally see us, not for what we lost, but for the fire we walked through and lived. Caleb Ward had not seen light since he was 10 years old. It happened on a summer night in the old barn behind his family's land, when he was still small enough to believe fireflies were spirits and lullabies could keep monsters away. That night, the lantern slipped from a hook, crashed into straw, and the world exploded in flame. His sister Naomi had been up in the hayloft, singing to herself as she always did. Soft and steady, the same tune their mother used to hum when mending quilts. Something about stars and safe places. He never saw her face again, but he remembered that song. As the barn burned, smoke clawing at his lungs and the searing heat curling his skin, that lullaby floated down through the fire. Even through his screams, even through the thunder of the beams collapsing, he heard her. And that was the last thing Caleb remembered seeing, the shimmer of firelight and the silhouette of his sister's legs dangling from the loft as her voice faded into silence. The blindness came fast, permanent, and with it the quiet rage of a child who felt punished by the very world he loved. But his mother, quiet, resilient, and marked by her own losses, never let him fall into despair. A healer by trade and a weaver by soul, she taught him something else, that the world did not disappear because he could no longer see it. It simply changed how it spoke. "Don't listen for noise, Caleb," she'd whisper, brushing his hair back with worn fingers. "Listen for the hush between things. That's where the truth lives." She walked with him into the woods barefoot, taught him the different sounds wind made depending on whether it passed through pine or juniper. She pressed his palms to the bark of trees and told him their names like old friends. She showed him how dust sounds when it's disturbed by deer, how silence gets heavy before a storm. By 13, Caleb could tell when someone was lying just by how they paused between words. By 15, he could sense sadness in a room even when no one spoke. And by the time he was a man, he had learned that blindness had not dulled his senses. It had refined them. He never saw faces, but he read footsteps, heard tremors in breath, felt intention in the way people opened doors or set their cups down. Years later, Caleb passed through a small border town, just another stranger with a cane and a worn coat, until he heard it, a lullaby drifting from a cracked window, sung by a woman with a voice that stopped time. The melody wasn't exact, but it carried something he hadn't felt since the fire, something soft, sacred, and impossibly familiar. It was Naomi's song, or perhaps just the echo of her, woven into someone else's grief. Caleb froze. His hands gripped the cane tighter. He didn't knock, didn't ask. That voice, Elena's voice, had already taken root inside him, the way Naomi's had once lived in his dreams. And he knew, if he ever heard that voice again, he'd follow it, even blind. He never forgot it. Years later, when the smell of dust and meat and cruelty filled the auction yard, and the crowd laughed at the girl with the scar and the voice that could make a rattler weep, Caleb stood still. Then she spoke, just a single word beneath her breath. And it wasn't the sound of her pain that stopped him. It was the truth inside her silence. His heart recognized her before his mind did. "Elena," he whispered to himself, though he didn't know her name yet, but he knew it was her, the girl who had once sung into a world that never deserved her kindness, the song that once brought him peace through flame. And without seeing her face, he stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said, "because you don't need eyes to see someone's soul." The cabin stood quietly beneath a canopy of tall pines, far from the grid of the trading post, and even farther from the places Elena feared would find her again. The wood of the walls was aged and split in some corners, but it smelled like cedar and ash, like safety worn thin, but still standing. Caleb called it home. Elena called it silence. Not the cold kind, like the cellars she'd once been locked in. Not the sharp kind, like after someone slammed a door. This silence was something different. It was soft, patient. It didn't demand anything of her. Neither did Caleb. He didn't ask where she'd come from. He didn't touch her unless she offered her hand first. He never even faced her fully when they spoke, as though he knew some wounds healed better in shadows. He pointed gently toward the stream behind the cabin when she looked thirsty. When he cooked, usually beans and something salted, he laid it on the table and then stepped away. The bed he gave her without a word. He slept on the floor, his cane propped nearby, his coat folded beneath his head like a worn banner of peace. Each day, Elena expected him to break the pattern, to shift, to show the part of himself that wanted something in return. He never did. And so slowly, the walls she'd wrapped around herself, tight as bandages, began to loosen. One morning, long after the frost had melted into spring, Elena wandered past the edge of the clearing. A sliver of land dipped between two trees, half covered in moss, but with a patch of soft earth exposed like a wound that had started to heal. She knelt and pressed her fingers into it. It was warm, damp, alive. She hadn't planted anything since before the fire, since before Mateo. She remembered her mother humming while placing rosemary in the earth, remembered thinking that flowers only grew where people still believed in gentleness. Elena had stopped believing in that long ago, but her hands moved anyway. She took a sharp stone and carved a shallow trench in the dirt. Then from the small cloth bag Caleb had left near the shelf, a bag filled with things she never asked for, but always found when she needed, she pulled out a few seeds. They looked plain, pale brown, almost forgettable. Still, she pushed them into the earth. And as she covered them, she whispered names. Not of people, but of the things she'd buried inside herself. Truth, bravery, forgiveness. She didn't know what would grow. Maybe nothing. Maybe that was the point. The days passed like the rhythm of a slow, steady song. No highs, no crashes. Just the quiet pulse of living. Elena swept the floors when pine needles blew in. She fetched water from the stream when the basin ran low. She didn't owe Caleb anything, but each small task made her feel something she hadn't in years. Useful, without being used. In the evenings, she'd sit near the fire, rubbing her scar unconsciously, the skin there still rough, still unfamiliar. She waited for the usual sting of memory, but lately it didn't come. Not as sharply, not as loudly. One night, while staring into the flames, she realized she hadn't hidden her face once that day. Not from the wind, not from the mirror above the basin, not from Caleb. He couldn't see it, of course. But somehow, he had never made her feel more visible. That night, something in the hills shifted. Caleb Ward sat by the fire, carving quietly when the scent of the forest changed, pine masked by steel and old tobacco. The wind didn't move wrong, but it hesitated. That was enough. Caleb set his carving down, reached for his cane. He'd lived long enough without sight to know. When the world stopped breathing, something was coming. He set the carving down, reached for his cane, and tilted his head slightly toward the door. A footstep, light, too light to be friendly. He stood slowly. Word had traveled like wildfire across the desert towns and saloon whispers. The scarred girl who escaped 3 brothels was alive, and she'd been claimed by a blind man hiding in the hills. To some, it was a curiosity. To Silas Beckett, it was an insult. He had once worn a captain's badge and a soldier's pride. Now he wore rings on every finger and dealt in people like cattle. Elena had been his most expensive failure, and men like Silas didn't forget things that bruised their ego, especially when others whispered behind their backs about a girl who got away. He didn't send a brute this time. He sent silence. No name, no voice, just a shadow in human skin. His loyalty was absolute, his success record perfect. He didn't ask questions. He simply followed orders and finished them. Silence stepped through the trees, knife drawn, eyes locked on the cabin's shape. The moonlight barely touched his silhouette. He moved like a ghost, No crunch of leaves, no breath, only intention. Inside, Caleb's voice cut through the dark. I know you're there. The assassin froze. I smell your steel, your fear, and I've seen men like you before, though not with these eyes. Silence inched forward, one boot barely brushing the porch step. If you touch her, Caleb said, cane now firm in his hand, I'll turn blindness into a weapon. The air pulsed, fire cracked. For a moment, time held its breath. Then a voice, low, graveled, and wrong, leaked from the assassin's mouth. Not his own, but rehearsed, a line given by another. You can't keep her, Silence said. She owes more than her voice. He turned and vanished into the woods without another sound, like a shadow retreating from dawn. Elena had been awake, standing behind the cabin door, every word burning like salt against old wounds. She didn't say anything until morning, and when she did, her voice was clear, hollow, decided. I'm leaving. Caleb didn't protest. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he stood in the doorway, cane tapping once against the floor. You could, he said softly, but not because you're unwelcome. She didn't answer. He turned toward her, eyes unseeing but heart open. I protect what I choose, Elena, but I do not cage what I love. She swallowed hard, not because he tried to stop her, but because he didn't. The fire was low that night, barely more than a flicker in the hearth. Outside, the wind threaded softly through the pine needles, whispering like it knew what was coming. Inside the cabin, silence hung thick, not the peaceful kind that filled most nights, but the kind that weighed down every breath. Elena sat curled near the fire, wrapped in one of Caleb's old wool blankets. Her fingers picked at the frayed edge, pulling tiny threads loose over and over. Her eyes didn't leave the flames. She had been quiet all day, quieter than usual. Caleb didn't push her. He simply sat on the floor across from her, legs crossed, hands resting lightly on his knees. His face was calm, turned slightly toward her, not watching, but waiting. Then her voice cracked the silence like a branch splitting in frost. His name was Mateo, she said. Caleb didn't speak, but she felt his attention settle like a hand on her shoulder, gentle, grounding. My little brother, she went on, voice low, hoarse from holding too much in for too long. He was 7. She stared deeper into the flames, and for a moment, she wasn't in the cabin. She was back there, in that adobe house with the warm kitchen, the rosemary hanging from the beams, the sound of her mother humming while she kneaded bread. It happened fast, she whispered. We were eating supper. My mother had just set the loaf on the table. And then, her breath hitched. Then the door broke open. Bandits. Filthy, loud, angry. They wanted coin, food, anything they could grab. She closed her eyes as if it helped hold back what came next. They laughed while they broke plates, tore down curtains just to hear the fabric rip. My father, her voice trembled. They shot him, and I don't even remember screaming. I just remember the heat. She paused, her hands trembling in her lap now. Mateo ran. He was smart like that. He knew they'd go after him if they saw him. So he hid in the storehouse out back. Her jaw tightened. But they didn't care. They lit it on fire anyway. A sound broke from her throat, half gasp, half sob. She didn't cry often. Even now the tears clung to the corners of her eyes but refused to fall. I heard him, she said. He was screaming, calling for me. Caleb's fingers curled slightly on his knee. I ran in, through the fire. I don't even remember the pain. I just knew I had to get him. She looked down at her hands, calloused now from weeks of chopping wood and scrubbing floors, but still scarred with faint lines that would never fade. I found him under the table, coughing. He was so small. I picked him up and told him to hold on, told him I had him. The tears came now, sharp and sudden, sliding down her cheeks without warning. I carried him out, through the smoke. My skin burned. My dress caught fire. I didn't stop. I didn't even care. Her voice broke. But he died before morning, right there, in my arms. She touched her face, the curved, angry scar that traced her cheek from bone to jaw. This is what I got for loving him. Caleb rose slowly. He crossed the room, one step at a time. guided not by vision, but by something deeper. When he reached her, he didn't sit. He knelt. Then with the gentlest touch, he reached out and placed his fingers against her scar. Not to trace it, not to test it, but to honor it. His hand was warm, steady, reverent. "Elena," he said, voice soft as rain on dry ground. "This is not a wound." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "It's a map," he whispered, "of every fire you crossed and refused to die in." That broke something wide open inside her. Elena began to cry. Not the quiet kind, not the kind she had learned to hide. She cried with her whole body, sobbed like a child who had carried too much, wept like a woman who had never been seen as more than broken, until now. And Caleb did not flinch. He simply pulled her into his arms, one hand at her back, the other still resting lightly on the scar. He held her while she fell apart. He held her until she didn't feel like pieces anymore. He held her like someone who finally saw her, not despite the pain, but because of it. The first light of dawn broke over the pines in a pale hush, casting the world in soft silver. The stream behind the cabin whispered as it always did, flowing gently between mossy stones, unaware of the decision being made near its edge. Elena stood with her back to it, her fingers tightening around a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Bread, dried meat, in a folded shawl. She had packed in silence while Caleb slept on the mat near the hearth. Or at least she thought he had been sleeping. She hadn't said goodbye. She couldn't bear to. Some people ran because they feared dying. Elena ran because she feared destroying the only good thing that hadn't asked her to change. The assassin's words echoed like poison in her ears. "You can't keep her. She owes more than her voice." She didn't want to bring that kind of danger here. Not to him. So she chose the path she'd always known, leaving before she became someone's burden. She was nearly to the stream when she heard it, the slow, steady tap of a cane against tree roots. Her breath caught. "Caleb." She turned, heart hammering. He stood not 10 paces away, his coat thrown over his shoulders, his boots still damp with dew. In his outstretched hand, he held something small and worn, a handkerchief, frayed, torn at the edges, embroidered faintly with the letter E. Her throat tightened. "I didn't keep it because it was yours," Caleb said quietly, as if afraid to break the stillness. "I kept it because that first night, when you dropped it near the fire, it reminded me someone out there was still alive." Elena stared at the cloth. She remembered holding it close while she slept, tucked between the folds of her dress like armor. "I thought I lost it," she murmured. "You didn't," he said. "You just left it behind." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the stream's murmuring. "I don't want to be rescued again," Elena said, her voice low but steady. "I don't want to be taken in like some stray needing saving. I want someone who'll walk beside me, through the fire, through the dark. Not in front of me, not behind me, with me." Caleb nodded once. "I cannot see the road," he replied, "but I will walk where your footsteps lead, as long as you want me there." The wind stirred between them, lifting strands of her hair. Then slowly, wordlessly, Elena let the bundle in her hands slip to the ground. She wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. She stepped forward, closed the space between them, and reached out, not for the handkerchief, but for his hand. Caleb didn't flinch. He took her fingers in his, held them like something precious, something not just found, but chosen. And in that moment, with the morning sun climbing higher and the trees leaning in like witnesses, they made no promises of forever, only of presence. And for Elena Solis, who had spent her life being owned, claimed, traded, and feared, that was more sacred than any vow. She was no longer running. She was finally home. Spring came to the mountains like a long exhale. Snowmelt whispered down through the cracks of stone, and buds pushed up from the thawed ground, tentative but determined. The cold had not left all at once. It never did. But the days grew longer, and the air softened, and in the clearing behind the cabin, life returned. Elena's garden bloomed first. Lavender spread in gentle purple waves, their scent warm and clean in the morning light. Tiny forget-me-nots curled around the stones she'd laid in a winding path. Wild roses burst open near the edge, unruly and beautiful. Just like her, she tended them each morning with bare hands, letting the soil work its way into her skin. There was no shame in dirt anymore, only proof that things could grow, even from ground once thought dead. Word spread again, but this time, not as whispers of scandal or survival. No, the rumors were different now. People spoke of the woman in the hills with the fire-scarred face and the angel's voice. Children wandered up the trail two at a time, barefoot or dusty, peeking from behind tree trunks. Elena didn't send them away. She sang to them. She taught them the names of each flower in both English and Spanish, sometimes even humming lullabies while they drew petals in charcoal across scraps of bark. Caleb sat with them too, his hands slowly carving wooden letters to help the youngest sound out words. He didn't need to see their smiles to feel their joy. The clearing became more than a refuge. It became a school, a storybook, a place where second chances could take root in the soil like seeds that refused to die. Elena had never dreamed of building something like that, but here it was, one moonlit night when the stars stretched wide over the hills and the trees hummed with crickets. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled something from his pocket. It was small, smooth, and warm from his touch. A pendant, hand-carved from cedar. Its surface was imperfect, the edges rough, but at its center bloomed a single flower, lavender etched in careful lines, as if he had memorized the shape through her hands. "I never had a ring," he said quietly. "Never learned how to make one right." Elena blinked, caught between surprise and stillness. He held the pendant out, suspended on a soft leather cord. "But if you wear this," he continued, "I'll know, no matter where the wind takes me, that you are home." She took it slowly, her fingers trembling as they closed around the wood. "I used to think," she whispered, "that no one could love a scar." Caleb stepped closer. His hand rose, slow and reverent, until his fingers brushed the curved mark on her cheek, the one she used to hide, the one no mirror had shown her kindly. "But I see light in it," he said. "I always have." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to his. And then, like dusk folding into night, they kissed. Not out of desperation, not from pain, but from shared, sacred choice. They called her cursed, but love called her home. Scars don't ruin stories. They mark the chapters where we refuse to end. They are proof not of what hurt us, but of how fiercely we lived in spite of it. Out here, where fire once scorched the hills, lavender blooms again. Maybe you've never run into a burning building. Maybe you don't carry a scar on your face, but somewhere deeper, where no one sees unless they care to look. And maybe, just maybe, you've spent years believing that your past disqualified you from peace, from love, from being truly seen. But let this story remind us, scars aren't the end of a story. They're the part that proves we lived. In a world that often praises perfection, Elena and Caleb show us something rare. That wholeness doesn't come from being untouched, but from being chosen, even with the cracks still showing. For many older Americans, especially those carrying years of quiet hurt or buried loss, this story might feel familiar. And it should, because survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just continuing to wake up and tend the garden, continuing to hold out a hand, even when you're not sure someone will take it. So we ask you, as the fire dies low and this tale comes to a close, have you ever been loved not despite your scars, but because of them? Do you believe that healing can still bloom, even in the most unlikely soil? Tell us in the comments. Whether you've carried pain in silence, found peace in a second chance, or still wait to be seen, your story matters. And if this journey stirred something inside you, tap like, subscribe. Stay with us for more Wild West love stories. Tales not just of romance, but of resilience, of the sacred, and of finding home in a world that never promised it. Because out here, where the world forgets, love remembers. And maybe, just maybe, the next story we tell could be yours.